She broke into his study to steal back her letter. He'd already memorized every word. The Morning Post arrived at 9:30, as it always did, and with it came the latest salvo in Mrs. Blackwell's unending campaign against her eldest daughter's spinsterhood. "Lady Pemberton's niece has married," her mother announced from behind the society pages, her voice carrying the particular pitch of maternal disappointment that Honoria had learned to recognize before she could walk. "The niece with the unfortunate chin. Even she has managed it, Honoria. Even she." Honoria did not look up from her toast. Perhaps her chin improved with age. I understand such things are possible. Her chin did not improve. I saw her at the Hartwell Musicale not 3 months past. If anything, it had grown more unfortunate. Mrs. Blackwell set down her paper with the gravity of a judge delivering sentence. "And yet she is married to a baronet's son, while you sit there eating toast as though you haven't a care in the world." "I have many cares, Mamma. Chief among them is whether cook has remembered to make the raspberry preserves I requested." "Honoria, she has not. This is clearly strawberry. My day is quite ruined." Her mother's sigh could have filled a cathedral. 4 seasons. 4 seasons I have presented you to society, dressed you in the finest gowns we can afford, paraded you before every eligible gentleman in London, and what have you to show for it? Nothing. Not a single offer. This was not, strictly speaking, true. There had been offers. Mr. Edmund Fairfax had proposed twice, once after too much punch at the midsummer ball, and once with cold calculation in his eyes that had made Honoria's skin crawl. A widowed viscount of advancing years had offered for her hand with the enthusiasm of a man purchasing livestock. And young Mr. Hartley had stammered through a proposal so incoherent that Honoria still wasn't entirely certain he hadn't been asking for directions to the retiring room. She had declined them all. "I am a trial to you, Mamma," Honoria said, reaching for her mother's abandoned teacup to refill it, a peace offering wrapped in porcelain. "I am aware, but consider if I marry, who will be here to torment you at breakfast? Cecily is far too sweet for proper torment. You would miss me dreadfully." Mrs. Blackwell accepted the tea with the air of a martyr accepting her cross. "I would miss you. God help me. I would. But I would rather miss you from the comfort of knowing you were settled, with a home and a husband and children of your own. You are 25, Honoria. 25, and as unmarried as the day you were born." I should hope I was unmarried the day I was born. The alternative suggests a rather progressive approach to infant matrimony that I'm not certain society would approve. You know perfectly well what I mean. Honoria did know. She knew that their father had died 3 years ago, leaving behind debts that had consumed most of their modest fortune. She knew that their townhouse was mortgaged, that the servants were owed back wages, that her mother's jewellery had been quietly sold piece by piece to maintain the appearance of gentility. She knew that her younger sister Cecily, beautiful and biddable and everything Honoria was not, would need a dowry for her own season, and that dowry would have to come from somewhere. She knew all of this because she was the one quietly solving it. But her mother could never know that. No one could ever know that Anora Blackwell, spinster daughter of the late Mr. Reginald Blackwell, was also the celebrated anonymous author known only as a lady of quality, whose Gothic novels had scandalized and delighted London for the past 3 years, whose latest book had sold an unprecedented 4,000 copies, and whose publishers' payments had kept the Blackwell family from complete ruin. If society discovered the truth, it would destroy them more thoroughly than poverty ever could. "I shall endeavour to be more marriageable, Mamma," Honoria said, rising from the table. "But first I must attend to correspondence. Lady Whitmore's Charity Committee requires a response." "Lady Whitmore's Charity Committee can wait. What you require is—" But Honoria was already escaping, her skirts whispering against the worn carpet as she fled toward the sanctuary of her small bedroom on the upper floor. She climbed the stairs with the particular speed of a woman who had perfected the art of strategic retreat, and only when her door was safely closed behind her did she allow herself to breathe. Her room was modest, a narrow bed with faded blue hangings, a washstand with a chipped basin, a wardrobe that held the same 5-day dresses she had worn for 3 seasons running. But it had one luxury that made it precious: a writing desk positioned beneath the window, where the morning light fell just so across the page. Anora crossed to the desk and retrieved the letter hidden in its false bottom, not the letter from her publisher, which she kept locked in a box beneath a loose floorboard, but the other letter, the one that had haunted her sleep for 3 weeks, the one that represented the single greatest act of foolishness she had ever committed. She unfolded it and read her own words again, though she had long since memorized every damning line. "My lord, I write to you as a stranger, though I confess I feel I know you, or rather, that I recognize something in you that I have long recognized in myself. Your essay on the manuscript traditions of medieval romance, published in the Quarterly Review, spoke not merely of parchment and provenance, but of something deeper: the human need to tell stories, to preserve what matters, to reach across centuries and say, 'I was here, I felt this, I was not alone.' I found myself weeping at your words, my lord, which I suspect was not your intended effect. You write with the precision of a scholar, but the passion of a poet, and I wonder if you know how rare that combination is. I wonder if you know how your phrase, 'the loneliness of the archivist,' surrounded by the words of the dead, seeking communion with minds long silent, struck me like a blow to the heart. I too am surrounded by words. I too seek communion with those who might understand. And I too wear masks, as you must, to survive in a world that has little patience for those who feel too deeply. The bravest thing one soul can do," I once wrote, "is recognize another." I did not know if I believed it when I wrote it, but reading your essay, I thought, here is someone who might understand. Here is someone who knows what it is to be alone in a crowded room, speaking a language no one else can hear. Perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps you are nothing like what your words suggest. But I could not rest without telling you that your essay moved me, that I am grateful you wrote it, and that somewhere in London there is a woman who thinks of you as a kindred spirit, though you do not know her name, and she will likely never know yours. Yours, in solitude and sympathy, a fellow traveller in the kingdom of words. The letter had seemed beautiful when she wrote it, brave even, a reaching out across the void to someone who might understand. Of course, she had been drunk. Her cousin Adelaide's wedding had been an exhausting affair, 12 courses, endless toasts, and her mother's pointed comparisons between Adelaide's triumphant march to the altar and Honoria's stubborn residence on the shelf. By the time the port made its 4th round, Honoria had retreated to the library with a purloined bottle of wine and a copy of the Quarterly Review that someone had left on a side table. She had read Lord Thornbury's essay 3 times. She had wept quietly into her wine-glass, overcome by the recognition of a fellow lonely soul speaking through the academic language of manuscript preservation. And then, in a fit of wine-soaked sentimentality, she had found paper and pen and poured out her heart to a man she had never met. She had signed it with a pseudonym. She had been that wise, at least, but she had also quoted her own novels, extensively. Lines that any dedicated reader of A Lady of Quality would recognize. Lines that, if Lord Thornbury should ever connect them to the scandalous authoress whose Gothic romances featured far too much passion and insufficient moral instruction, would lead him directly to her door. She had posted the letter the next morning, head pounding and hand trembling, before she could reconsider. By the time she realized what she had done, it was too late. Honoria folded the letter again, not the one she had sent, but a draft she had made, keeping it as evidence of her own foolishness and pressed her fingers to her temples. 3 weeks of trying to discover if Lord Thornbury had read her letter. 3 weeks of discreet inquiries that revealed nothing except that the Viscount Thornbury was a scholar and a recluse who rarely came to London and never engaged in correspondence with strangers. Surely he would simply discard it. Surely a man who received dozens of letters must throw away the ramblings of anonymous admirers without a second thought. But what if he didn't? A knock at her door made her thrust the letter back into the desk's false bottom. "Honoria?" Her sister's voice, soft and conspiratorial. "May I come in?" "Quickly." Cecily slipped through the door like a sunbeam sliding between curtains, golden-haired, pink-cheeked, and beautiful, in the effortless way that had always made Honoria feel like a muddy pond beside a crystal spring. At 19, Cecily was everything a young lady should be, sweet-tempered, accomplished, and possessed of the good sense to fall in love with a perfectly suitable young man whose family owned the estate adjoining Lord Thornbury's in Hampshire. She was also the only person alive who knew Honoria's secret. "You look dreadful," Cecily announced, perching on the edge of the bed. "Have you been reading that letter again?" "I don't know what you mean." "The letter you wrote to Lord Thornbury while intoxicated at Adelaide's wedding. The letter you cannot stop fretting about. That letter." "I am not fretting. I am contemplating." "You are fretting." Cecily reached out and took her sister's hands. "Honoria, it has been 3 weeks. If he were going to respond or worse, investigate, surely he would have done so by now. Perhaps he simply thought it was the work of a madwoman and threw it in the fire. Perhaps." Honoria pulled her hands free and began to pace. "Or perhaps he kept it. Perhaps he is even now examining the quotations and discovering that they match precisely with passages from The Castle of Shadows and The Phantom of Moorsgate Hall. Perhaps he is preparing to expose me to all of London." "Lord Thornbury?" Cecily laughed. "From everything George tells me, the man is practically a hermit. He cares for nothing but his books and manuscripts. He hasn't been to London in 3 years. He rarely even corresponds with his own family. And yet I corresponded with him, uninvited, unbidden, like a complete and utter fool." Cecily was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. "What did you say to him truly?" "You've never told me the whole of it." Honoria stopped pacing. The morning light caught her hair, setting the auburn strands aflame, and for a moment she looked less like a society spinster and more like the woman who wrote heroines brave enough to explore haunted abbeys and defy tyrannical guardians. "I told him he wasn't alone," she said quietly. "I told him I recognized something in his words. And I quoted God help me, Cecily. I quoted my own books without realizing what I was doing. Lines about loneliness, about the masks we wear, about the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might understand us truly. That doesn't sound so terrible. It sounds like the ramblings of a woman who drinks too much wine and fancies herself a romantic." Honoria resumed pacing. "It sounds like exactly the sort of letter that a man of Lord Thornbury's reputation would find absurd or suspicious or worthy of investigation. And if he investigates, if he discovers who wrote those words, then your secret is out, and all of society knows that proper spinsterish Anora Blackwell is actually a notorious authoress of scandalous fiction." Cecily's eyes sparkled with something that looked almost like admiration. "Honestly, Honoria, sometimes I think that wouldn't be so terrible. Your books are wonderful. People should know you wrote them. People should not know. Mamma would collapse. Our remaining social standing would evaporate. You would lose your chance with George because his family would never accept a connection to a woman who writes about," she gestured vaguely, "passions, and heroines who speak their minds, and heroes who actually respect their wives. George's family are not so provincial. George's family are the very definition of provincial. They are exactly provincial enough to be scandalized by exactly the sort of books I write." Honoria pressed her hands to her face. "I have to get that letter back. I have to know what he did with it, whether he read it, whether he's making inquiries. I cannot simply wait for disaster to find me." Cecily was quiet again, her brow furrowing in the way it did when she was working through a problem. She was not as quick as Honoria few people were, but she possessed a steady, practical intelligence that her sister often lacked. "Lord Thornbury has retired to his country estate for the autumn," she said finally. "George mentioned it last week. Ashworth Hall, in Hampshire. It's barely 10 miles from Fairfield Manor, where George's family lives. And this helps me how, precisely? Because George and I are secretly engaged." Cecily's cheeks flushed pink. "We haven't announced it yet. We're waiting until his parents host their autumn house party to make it official, but his mother has invited our family to attend. And Ashworth Hall. Lord Thornbury's elderly aunt lives there with him, Lady Marguerite Ashworth. George says she's been looking for a companion." Honoria stared at her sister. "You cannot possibly be suggesting what I think you're suggesting." "I am suggesting that you present yourself to Lady Marguerite as a companion, under an assumed name, of course. You gain access to the household, you find your letter, you destroy it, and you leave before anyone is the wiser." Cecily smiled, clearly pleased with herself. "It's exactly the sort of scheme your heroines would devise. My heroines also end up imprisoned in dungeons and nearly murdered by spectral monks. Their schemes do not, historically, go well. Their schemes always end in triumph, eventually." Cecily rose and crossed to take her sister's hands again. "Honoria, you have spent 3 weeks torturing yourself with possibilities. This is your chance to know for certain. And if Lord Thornbury has already read the letter, if he has already begun making inquiries, wouldn't you rather discover that now, while you can still control the narrative?" It was the word narrative that decided her. Honoria had built her life around narratives, stories she told herself, stories she told society, stories she wrote in secret by candlelight. If her narrative was about to shatter, she would rather be the one to shatter it. "Lady Marguerite is seeking a companion, you said? George can arrange an introduction. Your old governess, Miss Pembroke, retired to Hampshire years ago. She knows everyone in the county. She could provide a reference." "Under a false name. Under whatever name you choose." Honoria looked at her sister, sweet, practical, unexpectedly devious Cecily, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Miss Helena Black," she said slowly. "I shall be Miss Helena Black, lately of Northumberland, seeking genteel employment after the death of my elderly father. Helena Black. It's elegant. It suits you. It suits the woman I shall pretend to be." Honoria squared her shoulders, feeling the familiar rush of purpose that always accompanied the beginning of a new chapter. "Very well. Write to George. Tell him to make the arrangements. And pray, dear sister, that Lord Thornbury is as indifferent to his correspondence as his reputation suggests." 2 weeks later, Honoria stood in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall and tried not to let her terror show. The house was enormous, a sprawling Jacobean manor of honey-coloured stone, its mullioned windows glinting in the weak October sun. Ivy crawled up its western face, and ancient oaks surrounded it like sentinels, their leaves just beginning to turn gold. It was beautiful in the melancholy way of old houses that had seen too much history, and Honoria felt the familiar itch in her fingers that meant she wanted to write about it. She would not be writing about it. She would be infiltrating it, searching it, and escaping it as quickly as possible. "Miss Black?" The housekeeper, a formidable woman in black bombazine who had introduced herself as Mrs. Crawford, studied her with undisguised suspicion. "Lady Marguerite will receive you in the morning room. You understand that this is an interview. The position has not been formally offered." "Of course. I am grateful for the opportunity." Honoria kept her voice soft, unassuming, nothing like her usual sharp tones. Miss Helena Black was meek. Miss Helena Black was forgettable. Miss Helena Black would never dream of sneaking through a viscount's private study in the dead of night. Mrs. Crawford led her through corridors lined with portraits and past doorways that offered glimpses of rooms crowded with books, artifacts, and the accumulated treasures of generations. Honoria memorized the layout as they walked: front hall to main staircase, east corridor to morning room, and there a closed door of heavy oak with a brass plate reading library that must lead to the master's domain. She would find Lord Thornbury's study. She would find her letter, and she would put this entire disaster behind her. Lady Marguerite Ashworth was not what Honoria had expected. George's description had conjured a frail invalid, elderly and easily managed. The woman who awaited her in the morning room was sharp-eyed and silver-haired, seated ramrod straight in a chair by the fire with a book open in her lap. She must have been 80 if she was a day, but there was nothing fragile about the gaze she turned on Honoria. "So," Lady Marguerite said, not bothering with pleasantries, "you are the companion Miss Pembroke has recommended." "Yes, my lady. Miss Helena Black. At your service." Helena Black. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Unusual name. Black is quite common, of course, but Helena, that's classical. Your parents were educated?" "My father was a scholar of modest means. He instilled in me a love of literature." "Did he indeed?" Lady Marguerite gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit. Let me look at you properly." Honoria sat, keeping her posture perfect and her expression pleasant. She was acutely aware that her worn travelling dress, deliberately chosen to suggest genteel poverty, was being assessed, along with her hair, her hands, her every gesture. "You're too pretty," Lady Marguerite announced. "Pretty companions cause trouble. Young men hang about, disrupting the household." "I have rarely been called pretty, my lady. Passable, perhaps." "Don't fish for compliments. It's unbecoming." "You're pretty in an unusual way, all that red hair and those sharp eyes. My nephew will notice you, and he notices nothing these days. That could be interesting or catastrophic." Lady Marguerite smiled, showing teeth that were still remarkably white. "Tell me, Miss Black, why should I hire you instead of the 20 other desperate gentlewomen who have applied for this position?" "Because I need to search your nephew's study for evidence of my own foolishness," Honoria did not say. "Because I have 2 weeks at most before my family arrives for the Fairfields' house party, and I need to complete my mission before anyone recognizes me." "Because I will not bore you," she said instead. "I can discuss literature, history, and politics without fainting at a strong opinion. I play chess and cards with reasonable skill. And I have been reliably informed that I am excellent at reading aloud, should you desire it." Lady Marguerite laughed a sudden, startling sound. "Reading aloud! None of the others mentioned that. They were all too busy assuring me of their embroidery skills and their devotion to Christian charity." She snapped her book closed. "Tell me, Miss Black, have you read The Castle of Shadows?" Honoria's heart stopped. I beg your pardon?" "The Castle of Shadows. A Gothic novel. Published 2 years ago by an anonymous authoress calling herself a lady of quality." Lady Marguerite's eyes glittered with something that might have been mischief. "I am given to understand it is quite scandalous. A young woman imprisoned in a crumbling castle, a mysterious count with a dark secret, altogether too much passion for proper society to approve." "I may have heard of it." Honoria forced her voice to remain steady. "I am not certain I have read it myself." "Pity. It's magnificent. Utter rubbish. Of course, the plot makes no sense if you examine it closely, but the writing is extraordinary. The authoress understands loneliness in a way that few writers do." Lady Marguerite tilted her head, studying Honoria with unnerving intensity. "My nephew despises novels, or claims to. But I found a copy of The Castle of Shadows in his study last month. hidden behind a treatise on medieval Latin. What do you make of that? What Honoria made of it was that her heart was attempting to beat its way out of her chest. Lord Thornbury had read her book. Lord Thornbury, who despised novels, had secretly purchased and hidden her book. This was either very good news or very, very bad. "I suppose," she said carefully, "that even scholars occasionally seek entertainment." "Perhaps." Lady Marguerite smiled again, showing those improbable teeth. "Or perhaps he is not quite as cold as he wishes the world to believe. We are none of us only one thing, Miss Black. Remember that, if you remember nothing else." She rose, moving with surprising energy for a woman of her years. "You are hired. Mrs. Crawford will show you to your room. Dinner is at 7, and my nephew dines with me 3 evenings per week. He will be absent tonight, visiting the neighbouring estate, so you needn't worry about making his acquaintance immediately." Relief flooded through Honoria. "Thank you, my lady. I am honoured by your trust." "Don't be honoured. Be useful." "And Miss Black—" Lady Marguerite paused at the door, looking back with an expression Honoria couldn't quite read. "When you meet my nephew, try not to let him intimidate you. His bark is considerably worse than his bite, though he would never admit it." She swept out, leaving Honoria alone with the fire and the creeping certainty that she had vastly underestimated what she was walking into. The room they gave her was small but comfortable, tucked into a corner of the east wing with a window overlooking the gardens. Honoria spent the afternoon unpacking her meagre belongings and memorizing the household schedule. Breakfast at 8, Lady Marguerite's morning rest from 10 to noon, afternoon activities varying by the ladies' whims, dinner at 7. The staff numbered 14, including Mrs. Crawford, and the household ran with the precision of a well-maintained clock. More importantly, she learned that Lord Thornbury kept to his study most evenings, that the study was located in the west wing on the ground floor, and that he had given explicit instructions that he was not to be disturbed during his work. Tonight, he would be dining at the neighbouring estate. Tonight, his study would be empty. Honoria had roughly 6 hours to search. She dined in her room, claiming fatigue from travel, and spent the early evening reading with strained concentration while the autumn dark crept past her window. At 10 o'clock, she heard Lady Marguerite's maid helping the old woman to bed. At 11, the household fell silent. At 11:30, Honoria wrapped herself in a dark shawl and slipped out of her room. The corridors of Ashworth Hall were transformed by night. The familiar proportions of afternoon shadowed into strange geometries, the portraits looming from their frames like disapproving ancestors. Honoria moved silently, grateful for the thick carpets that muffled her footsteps, counting doorways until she reached the west wing. Lord Thornbury's study was exactly where she remembered the heavy oak door with its brass plate, now gleaming faintly in the moonlight that spilled through a high window. She tried the handle. Unlocked. Honoria slipped inside and caught her breath. The study was a cathedral of books. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling on every wall, crammed with volumes that ranged from leather-bound folios to cheap paper pamphlets. Manuscripts in protective cases occupied places of honor on pedestals. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface buried under correspondence and notes, and the smell leather and paper and beeswax and ink, the sacred incense of the dedicated scholar wrapped around her like an embrace. For a moment, Honoria forgot why she had come. She forgot the letter, forgot the danger, forgot everything except the pure joy of being surrounded by so many books, so many words, so much accumulated human thought. Then she remembered, and her fingers began to shake. The desk first. She moved toward it, pulling the shawl tighter, and began to search. Letters, dozens of them, from scholars and collectors and antiquarians across Europe. Bills of sale for manuscripts. notes in a cramped, angular hand that must be Lord Thornbury's own, observations on dating techniques and binding styles and the provenance of particular texts. She rifled through them as quickly as she dared, searching for her own handwriting, her own paper, her own damning words. Nothing. The drawers, then. She opened them one by one, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the whole household could hear. More papers, a collection of quills, a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair and sad eyes. His wife, perhaps, the one who had died. Sealing wax in 3 colors. A packet of letters tied with black ribbon that felt too private to examine. Still nothing. The correspondence box. It sat on a side table near the window, a mahogany case with a brass clasp. Honoria crossed to it, unfastened the clasp, began to sort through the contents. "Looking for something, Miss Black?" She spun, heart in her throat, and saw him. He sat in a wing-back chair by the cold fireplace, so still that she had not noticed him in the shadows. His long legs were crossed at the ankle, his coat discarded over the back of the chair, his waistcoat unfastened in a way that suggested he had been sitting there for some time. His face was all planes and angles in the moonlight, sharp cheekbones and a stern mouth, and eyes that caught the light like chips of grey ice. And in his hand, creased from repeated handling, was her letter. "Or should I say," Lord Thornbury continued, his voice as cold as his eyes, "Miss Blackwell?" The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Honoria gripped the edge of the side table, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no escape. He knew. He knew who she was, which meant he had investigated, which meant, "I see from your expression that you did not expect to find me here." Lord Thornbury rose from his chair, unfolding to his full height, which was considerable. He must have been well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, moving with the coiled grace of a man who kept himself in condition despite his scholarly reputation. "I was supposed to be dining with the Fairfields. I'm sure you made certain of that before beginning your search." Her voice emerged as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I can explain." "Can you?" He moved closer, each step deliberate, the letter held casually at his side as though it meant nothing. "Can you explain why you have entered my household under a false identity? Why you have infiltrated the position of my aunt's companion? Why you are currently rifling through my private correspondence in the dead of night?" "I wanted my letter back. Evidently." He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough that she could see the silver threads at his temples, the fine lines around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. "You wrote to me 3 weeks ago. An anonymous letter, effusive and earnest, with sentiments that I found unexpected. I was not in my right mind when I wrote it. I had been drinking." "Had you?" Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, but near enough. "Wine loosens many tongues. It rarely produces such eloquence." Honoria stared at him. This was not going as she had expected. He should be angry. He should be threatening her with exposure, demanding explanations, calling for the servants. Instead, he stood there like a statue of himself, studying her with those pale eyes. "How did you know who I was?" she asked. "I signed the letter with a pseudonym. You quoted extensively from The Castle of Shadows, and The Phantom of Morsgate Hall, and, if I am not mistaken, the forthcoming 3rd volume in the series, which I have obtained in proof form through a connection with your publisher." He paused, watching her face. "You are a lady of quality. I suspected it from the first reading. Your letter confirmed it." "And you told no one?" "Why would I tell anyone? Your secret is yours to keep or reveal as you choose." He lifted the letter, smoothing its creases with long fingers. "I was more interested in why you wrote to me at all. A celebrated authoress, corresponding with a reclusive scholar. Surely you have better uses for your time." "I told you. I was drunk." "You told me many things. His voice softened, losing some of its ice. You told me that my essay on manuscript traditions spoke not merely of parchment and provenance, but of something deeper. You told me that you wept at my words, which, I confess, was indeed not my intended effect. You told me that you wear masks, as I must, to survive in a world that has little patience for those who feel too deeply. Anora closed her eyes. Hearing her own words in his voice was unbearable, like watching someone read her diary aloud, every private thought exposed to the cold air. I told you things I should not have said. Yes. He moved closer still, and she opened her eyes to find him barely 2 paces away, the letter now held between them like a barrier or a bridge. You told me that the bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another. You told me that you thought of me as a kindred spirit. You reached across the void, Miss Blackwell, to a man you had never met, and you offered him something precious, your honest self, unmasked, unguarded. I made a fool of myself. Did you? He was so close now that she could smell him, sandalwood and old paper, and something darker, richer, underneath. Or did you simply do what you always do in your writing? Tell the truth that everyone else is too afraid to speak? Anora had no answer for that. She had spent 3 weeks imagining this confrontation, preparing defenses and explanations, but she had never imagined this, his stillness, his intensity, the way he looked at her as though she were a manuscript he had spent years searching for. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "You know who I am. You know my secret. You could destroy me with a word." "I could." He tilted his head, still studying her. "But that would be a waste. I have spent 3 weeks reading and rereading your letter, Miss Blackwell. I have, I confess, memorized it entirely. And I have asked myself the same question every night. Who is this woman who sees so clearly, who writes so bravely, who reached out to me in my isolation and offered understanding without asking for anything in return? And what answer did you find? That I needed to meet her." He stepped back, putting space between them, and his voice hardened again. "Which is why I am particularly offended that she has entered my household under false pretenses, clearly intending to steal her letter and disappear before I could discover her identity. I did not know you had read it. I hoped. You hoped I had thrown it away unread. You hoped you could erase your moment of vulnerability and return to your masks and your pretenses." He shook his head slowly. "I am afraid that is no longer possible, Miss Blackwell. I have read your letter. I have read it 100 times, and I find myself unwilling to let you simply vanish." "What do you mean?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then he moved to his desk, set the letter down among the scattered papers, and turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your sister is engaged to George Fairfield, is she not? The families are gathering next week for an informal celebration of the betrothal." Anora's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" "The Fairfields are my neighbours. Mrs. Fairfield has been corresponding with my aunt for weeks, planning the festivities. Your family is expected to arrive in 4 days." He paused, letting this sink in. "Which presents us with a difficulty. You are currently installed in my household as Miss Helena Black. If you leave now, your abrupt departure will raise questions. If you remain, your family's arrival will expose your masquerade." "I will leave tonight. Now. Before anyone." "No." The word was flat, final. "You will remain. You will continue as my aunt's companion until the house party concludes, and you will help me understand why you wrote what you wrote. You cannot compel me to stay. I can inform your mother of your presence here. I can reveal to the assembled guests that the respectable Miss Blackwell has been skulking about my house under a false identity. I can, if pressed, make inquiries about your publishing arrangements that would interest society greatly." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. Or you can stay. Answer my questions. Satisfy my curiosity about the woman who saw through my masks. And when the house party ends, you may leave with your secrets intact. Anora felt the trap closing around her. He had her completely, her identity, her authorship, her presence in his house at midnight. There was no move she could make that would not lead to disaster, except perhaps the move he was offering. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what I meant by my letter? You don't know me. I don't know you. We are strangers who have exchanged a handful of words, most of them written while I was intoxicated." Lord Thornbury was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its cutting edge. "My wife died 5 years ago," he said, "in childbirth. She and the baby both. I was not kind to myself afterward. I retreated from the world, from feeling, from anything that reminded me of what I had lost. I built walls so high and so thick that I thought nothing would ever breach them again." He picked up the letter, looking at it rather than at her. "And then I received this. A letter from a stranger who claimed to recognize something in my words, who spoke of masks and loneliness and the desperate hope that someone might understand, who quoted without knowing I would recognize them passages from novels that I had been reading in secret, novels that made me feel something when I thought I was incapable of feeling." He looked up, and his grey eyes were no longer cold. "Your letter made me weep, Miss Blackwell. For the first time in 5 years, I wept, and I have been waiting ever since to meet the woman who wrote it." Anora found that she could not speak. Her throat had closed, her eyes were burning, and something in her chest felt dangerously close to cracking open. "I don't," she started, and stopped. "I didn't know about your wife, your child. I didn't know. How could you? We have never met." He set the letter down again, carefully, as though it were made of glass. "But you knew something. You recognized something in my writing that told you I was lonely. That I wore masks, that I might understand what it meant to feel too deeply in a world that punishes feeling." He paused. "Was that a lie, Miss Blackwell? An invention? Or did you mean what you wrote?" "I meant it." The words came out before she could stop them, too honest, too raw, exactly the kind of admission that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. "I meant every word. I read your essay and I thought I had found someone who might understand. Someone who knew what it was to be alone in a crowded room. Someone who—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as though she could force the words back in. Lord Thornbury's expression shifted, something softening, something warming. "Stay," he said again. But this time it was not a command. "Stay and let me know you. The real you, not Miss Helena Black. Not a lady of quality. The woman who wrote to a stranger because she could not bear to be alone anymore. And if I refuse? Then you refuse. I will not expose you. I give you my word. Your secrets are safe regardless of what you choose." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "But I hope you will stay. I have been waiting a long time to meet someone who speaks my language, Miss Blackwell. I find I am not ready to let you disappear quite yet." He left her there, surrounded by his books and his papers and the lingering scent of him, with her letter lying on his desk like an accusation and a promise. Anora stood in the darkness for a long time, her heart pounding, her mind racing, her whole world tilting on its axis. She had come here to destroy evidence of her foolishness. Instead, she had discovered that her foolishness had reached someone who needed it desperately. And now she had a choice to make. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight. And Anora Blackwell, who had built her life on masks and pretenses, felt them beginning to crack. She crossed to the desk, picked up her letter, and read her own words one more time. The bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another. She had written those words in a novel, never expecting to live them. But here, now, in this house of books and shadows, she had been recognized, seen, understood. It was terrifying. It was also, perhaps, exactly what she had been searching for. Anora folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Then she walked to the door, stepped into the darkened corridor, and began the long journey back to her room. She would stay. God help her, she would stay. And tomorrow she would begin the dangerous work of letting Lord Sebastian Ashworth see who she really was. The morning after her midnight confrontation with Lord Thornbury, Anora woke to pale autumn sunlight and the profound conviction that she had made a terrible mistake. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and catalogued the ways her situation had deteriorated. She had come to Ashworth Hall to retrieve a letter and disappear. Instead, she had been discovered, threatened, and somehow convinced to remain as a willing participant in whatever game the Viscount was playing. Her family would arrive in 4 days. Her sister's engagement celebration would bring dozens of guests who might recognize her. And she had agreed to let a man she barely knew see behind the masks she had spent a lifetime constructing. What had she been thinking? She had not been thinking. That was the problem. She had been feeling, responding to the pain in his voice, the loneliness in his eyes, the devastating revelation that her drunken letter had made him weep for the first time in 5 years. She had let emotion override reason, and now she was trapped in a web of her own making. A knock at her door interrupted her spiral of regret. "Miss Black?" Mrs. Crawford's voice, crisp with disapproval. "Lady Marguerite requests your presence at breakfast. You have 10 minutes. Anora dressed quickly, choosing the plainest of her plain dresses, dove grey wool with minimal trimming, and scraped her hair back into the severest knot she could manage. Miss Helena Black was meant to be forgettable. The more invisible she became, the better her chances of surviving the next week without disaster. The breakfast room was flooded with morning light, and Lady Marguerite presided over the table like a queen holding court. She wore burgundy silk despite the early hour, her silver hair pinned beneath a lace cap, her sharp eyes tracking Honora's entrance with evident interest. "There you are," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. "Sit. Eat. You look as though you haven't slept." "I slept quite well, my lady." The lie came easily, too easily. Anora had spent most of the night staring at her ceiling, reliving every word of her conversation with Lord Thornbury. Nonsense. "You have circles beneath your eyes that could rival my nephew's." Lady Marguerite poured tea with the authority of long practice. "Speaking of Sebastian, he asked to be informed when you came down. I expect he will join us shortly." Honora's hand jerked, nearly overturning her cup. "Lord Thornbury takes breakfast with you?" "When it suits him. Which is rarely. I admit the man keeps scholar's hours, working half the night and sleeping half the morning. But today he specifically requested to be present." Lady Marguerite's eyes glittered with something that looked suspiciously like amusement. "One might almost think he was interested in making your acquaintance." Before Anora could formulate a response, the door opened and Lord Thornbury entered. He looked different in daylight, less like a figure from a Gothic novel, and more like an ordinary man, albeit an extraordinarily handsome one. His dark hair was damp from washing, his jaw freshly shaved, his clothing the simple elegance of a country gentleman at leisure. But his eyes, when they found hers across the room, held the same intensity she remembered from the night before. "Good morning, Aunt," he said, bending to kiss Lady Marguerite's cheek. "Miss Black, I trust you slept well?" The emphasis on her false name was subtle but unmistakable. Anora lifted her chin. "Tolerably well, my lord. The accommodations are most comfortable. I am glad to hear it. He took the seat across from her, accepting the cup of coffee his aunt poured without looking away from Honoria's face. I understand you are a great reader, Miss Black. Perhaps you would care to visit my library this morning? I have recently acquired several volumes that might interest a woman of literary inclination. Sebastian. Lady Marguerite's voice carried a warning note. Miss Black is my companion, not yours. I have need of her this morning. Surely you can spare her for an hour. The collection is quite remarkable, and Miss Black strikes me as someone who would appreciate it properly. The two of them locked eyes in what was clearly a familiar battle of wills. Honoria watched, fascinated, as some silent communication passed between them. 1 hour, Lady Marguerite said finally, and you will return her in the same condition you found her. No terrorizing the help, Sebastian. I never terrorize anyone, Aunt. I merely encourage honesty. He rose, extending his hand toward Honoria with the courtly grace of a man born to privilege. She had no choice but to accept it, letting him draw her to her feet, while Lady Marguerite watched with an expression of barely concealed delight. Come, Miss Black, Lord Thornbury said, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. Let me show you my books. The library by daylight was even more impressive than it had been in moonlit shadow. Sunshine poured through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like golden snow. The books seemed to glow thousands of spines in every color, every size, arranged with the careful organization of a mind that valued order above all else. Lord Thornbury released her arm and moved to close the door behind them. The soft click of the latch felt significant, sealing them into a private world. You came, he said simply. Did I have a choice? You always have a choice, Miss Blackwell. You could have fled in the night. You could have claimed illness and kept to your room. Instead, you dressed and came down to breakfast, knowing I would be there. Honoria moved away from him, trailing her fingers along the spines of books she passed. Perhaps I was simply hungry. Perhaps. He leaned against a reading table, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Or perhaps you are as curious about me as I am about you. You flatter yourself, my lord. Do I? He pushed away from the table and began to walk toward her, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet. Then tell me, Miss Blackwell, why did you write to me? The real reason, not the excuse about wine and sentiment. She turned to face him, keeping a shelf of books between them like a barricade. I told you the real reason last night. I read your essay and felt recognized, understood. I acted on impulse and regretted it immediately. But you did not write to retract your words. You did not send a follow-up letter explaining that you had been temporarily mad. He stopped on the other side of the shelf, so close she could have touched him if she reached across the books. You let the letter stand. You let a stranger possess your honest thoughts for 3 weeks without attempting to reclaim them until you realized I might discover your identity. I was afraid. Of what? Of exactly this. She gestured between them, at the library, at the impossible situation she found herself in. Of being known, of having someone see past the masks and find whatever is underneath. Lord Thornbury was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the shelf and took her hand, a simple gesture, but it sent a shock through her entire body. What do you think is underneath, Miss Blackwell? I don't know. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. That is what terrifies me. He held her gaze for a long moment, his grey eyes searching hers as though looking for something specific. Then he released her hand and stepped back, breaking the spell. I have a proposal, he said, his tone shifting to something more businesslike. For the duration of your stay, I suggest we conduct an experiment. An experiment? Yes. You will tell me one true thing each day, something you have never told anyone, something that frightens you to speak aloud, and I will do the same. He began to walk along the shelves, not looking at her. At the end of the week, when your family arrives and your masquerade necessarily concludes, we will both know whether the connection you wrote about in your letter was real or imagined. Anora stared at his back, trying to understand what he was offering. You want to trade secrets? I want to trade truths. There is a difference. He pulled a book from the shelf and turned to face her, holding it between them. Your novels are full of secrets, mysterious pasts, hidden identities, revelations that change everything. But they are also full of something rarer. Moments when characters speak honestly to each other, stripping away pretense and revealing their authentic selves. Those are novels, fiction. The characters can afford to be honest because their honesty serves the story. And in life, can we not afford the same honesty? In life, honesty has consequences. Honesty destroys reputations, ends relationships, shatters the careful structures we build to protect ourselves. Yes. He set the book down and moved closer, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the silver threads at his temples. And yet you wrote to me anyway. You sent a letter full of honest sentiment to a complete stranger, knowing it could destroy you. Why? Because I was lonely. Because I was tired of pretending. Because I read your words and thought, for one desperate moment, that someone might finally understand. She did not say any of this. Instead, she asked, "What truth would you share with me today, my lord?" He smiled a real smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely. The cold marble Viscount disappeared, replaced by a man who looked almost vulnerable. "My truth for today," he said slowly, "is that I have not spoken honestly to anyone since my wife died. I have exchanged pleasantries, conducted business, performed the role of Viscount and scholar and gentleman. But I have not said a true thing, a thing that matters in 5 years." He paused, and his smile faded into something more serious. "Until last night. Until I read your letter aloud to you and told you what it meant to me." Anora felt something shift in her chest, some wall beginning to crumble. That must have been very lonely. It was. It is. He held her gaze. "Your turn, Miss Blackwell. One truth. Any truth." She should refuse. She should make her excuses and return to Lady Marguerite and spend the next 4 days being as invisible as possible. She should protect herself from this man and his dangerous intensity. Instead, she heard herself say, "I write because I cannot stop. It is not a choice or a hobby. It is a compulsion, as necessary as breathing. When I do not write, I feel as though I am slowly suffocating." Lord Thornbury's expression softened. "I suspected as much. Your prose has the quality of necessity words that had to be written, not words that were crafted for effect. Is that a compliment? It is an observation. Compliments would be inefficient." But his eyes were warm, and something in his voice suggested he was not as immune to sentiment as he pretended. A clock somewhere in the house chimed the hour, breaking the strange intimacy of the moment. "Your hour is nearly up," Lord Thornbury said. "My aunt will come looking for you if I keep you much longer." "Then I should return." Anora moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at him. "This experiment of yours, is it truly about understanding, or is it about something else? What else would it be about? Control, information, leverage." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "You know my secrets now. Every truth I share gives you more power over me." "Yes." He did not deny it. "And every truth I share gives you power over me. That is the nature of honesty. It creates vulnerability on both sides." He moved to open the door for her, his hand brushing hers as he reached past. "The question is whether you trust me enough to be vulnerable." I don't know you well enough to trust you. Then perhaps you should get to know me better. He held the door open, gesturing for her to pass. Same time tomorrow, Miss Blackwell. Bring a truth worth telling. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of public performance and private revelation. During the day, Anora was Miss Helena Black, dutiful companion to Lady Marguerite, unremarkable gentlewoman of modest means and pleasant disposition. She read aloud from novels the old woman selected with suspicious precision, always somehow books that touched on themes of identity and transformation. She accompanied Lady Marguerite on slow walks through the autumn gardens. She played chess in the evenings and lost badly, though she suspected the old woman was cheating. But each morning she visited the library, and Lord Thornbury was waiting for her. Their conversations began with the exchange of truths, awkward at first, both of them testing the boundaries of what could be safely revealed. He told her about his wife, Elizabeth, who had been kind but distant, their marriage arranged for practical purposes rather than love. She told him about her father's debts, the slow erosion of their family's fortune, the desperate gamble of publishing novels to keep them afloat. He told her about the night his wife went into labor, how he had paced outside the room for 18 hours, how the silence when it finally came had been worse than any scream. She told him about the first time she saw her name, her pseudonym in print, how she had wept with a complicated mixture of triumph and terror. The truths grew deeper, more dangerous. I married Elizabeth because she reminded me of someone I could not have, he said on the third morning, standing at the window with his back to her. A woman I met in my youth, wild and brilliant and entirely unsuitable. I spent my marriage trying to find that spark in my wife's eyes and hating myself for looking. I have never been kissed, Anora confessed in return, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Not truly kissed, not the way my heroines are kissed. My suitors have pressed their lips to my hand, to my cheek once, but no one has ever... She stopped, mortified. That is a ridiculous thing to share. I should not have said it. Why not? He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. It is a truth. That was the agreement. It is an embarrassing truth. It makes me sound like a pathetic spinster, 25 years old and never properly kissed. It makes you sound like a woman with standards. He crossed the room toward her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. A woman who will not settle for mere pressing of lips when she has imagined so much more. I write about things I have never experienced. That is the novelist's prerogative. Is it? He stopped an arm's length away. I have often wondered how you write such convincing passion when you have apparently never felt it. Imagination, observation, a willingness to extrapolate from limited data. Ah. His mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. Scientific romance. How very modern. You are mocking me. I am admiring you. He said it simply, without artifice, and Anora felt something flutter in her chest. You have built an entire career on the courage to imagine what you have not experienced. That takes a particular kind of bravery, or foolishness. The two are often indistinguishable. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so intimate, so unexpected, that she forgot to breathe. Tomorrow your family arrives. Our experiment will necessarily conclude. Yes. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, breathless and uncertain. I suppose it will. Then perhaps we should make the most of today. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them, and his expression shifted to something more formal. I have arranged a private tour of my manuscript collection. There are items I think would interest you, including the original correspondence of a certain Gothic novelist whose work bears remarkable similarity to your own. What do you mean? I mean that Anne Radcliffe herself wrote letters about her craft, and I have acquired several of them. I thought you might like to see how another woman navigated the challenges of writing in a world that does not take women's writing seriously." Anora stared at him, something warm blooming behind her ribs. "You collected those letters for me?" "I collected them because they are historically significant. That you might find them personally meaningful is merely a fortunate coincidence." But his eyes told a different story, a story of careful attention, of deliberate thoughtfulness, of a man who had been paying far more attention to her interests than he pretended. "Thank you," she said softly. "That is unexpectedly kind." "I am not kind. I am curious." He gestured toward the door that led to his private study. "Shall we?" They spent the morning surrounded by treasures, manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf, letters in faded ink from writers whose words had shaped the language, first editions of books that Anora had loved since childhood. Lord Thornbury showed her each item with the reverence of a man in church, explaining provenance and significance while watching her reactions with barely concealed pleasure. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, turning the pages of a medieval book of hours with careful fingers. "The artistry, the detail, someone spent years of their life creating this. Brother Thomas of Whitmore Abbey. We know his name from the colophon he signed his work, which was unusual for the period. Sebastian, she had begun to think of him as Sebastian, though she did not dare use his Christian name aloud, moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. He died 3 years after completing it, a sweating sickness that took half the monastery. How do you know that? Research, records, the patient accumulation of small truths until a larger picture emerges. He paused, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Rather like getting to know a person, actually. Is that what you've been doing? Accumulating small truths about me until a larger picture emerges? Yes. He did not look away. And you have been doing the same to me. We are both, I think, natural scholars gathering evidence, forming hypotheses, testing our conclusions. What hypothesis have you formed about me? Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes searching her face. That you are far braver than you believe yourself to be. That your wit is a shield, not a weapon. That you have spent your entire life believing yourself unworthy of the love your heroines find, and that you write about passion so convincingly because you desperately want to believe it exists. Honora's throat tightened. That is quite a hypothesis. Am I wrong? She wanted to lie. She wanted to laugh it off, to deflect with clever words, to retreat behind the masks she had worn for so long. But something about this room, this man, this strange week of shared truths had stripped away her defenses. No, she whispered, you are not wrong. Sebastian exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath. Then I have one more question, and I need you to answer honestly. What question? When your family arrives tomorrow, when Miss Helena Black must disappear and Miss Anora Blackwell must take her place, do you intend to leave Ashworth Hall, to return to London and pretend this week never happened? Anora looked at him, at this complicated, wounded, unexpectedly gentle man who had somehow seen through every wall she had built and felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. I don't know, she admitted. I came here intending to retrieve a letter and vanish. But now I am not certain I want to vanish. The confession felt enormous, terrifying, like stepping off a cliff without knowing if the ground would catch her. Now I think perhaps I want to stay and see what happens next. Something flickered in Sebastian's eyes. Hope, perhaps, or something very like it. Then stay, he said simply. When the masquerade ends, stay as yourself. Let me introduce you to my aunt, to our guests, as who you truly are. And how would you explain my presence? The sudden appearance of a woman who looks remarkably like your aunt's former companion? Leave that to me. He reached out and took her hand, holding it between both of his. Trust me, Honoria. One more day. Give me one more day to prove that what we have found here is worth preserving. She should refuse. She should withdraw her hand, make her excuses, retreat to the safety of her room and her masks and her careful defenses. She should protect herself from this man who had somehow slipped past every wall she had built. Instead, she said, "One more day." The Fairfields arrived the following afternoon in a flurry of carriages and luggage and the particular chaos that accompanies large families gathering for celebrations. Honoria watched from the window of Lady Marguerite's sitting room as George Fairfield handed her sister down from the carriage. Cecily looked radiant in a travelling dress of pale blue, her golden hair catching the weak autumn sun, her face alight with the particular joy of a woman in love. Their mother followed, and then George's parents, and then an assortment of cousins and relations that Honoria recognized from years of London seasons. And there, among the last to emerge, was a figure that made her blood run cold. Edmund Fairfax. She had not known he was connected to the Fairfield family. She had not imagined in her worst nightmares that he would be among the guests at Cecily's engagement celebration. But there he was, tall and fair and handsome, in the way of men who know their own worth too well, helping himself down from the carriage with the proprietary air of someone who belonged. "Miss Black?" Lady Marguerite's voice interrupted her spiralling panic. "You have gone quite pale. Are you unwell?" Honoria tore her gaze from the window. "I am perfectly well, my lady, merely overwhelmed by the arrival of so many guests." Lady Marguerite's sharp eyes missed nothing. "You know some of them, I think, beyond what you have told me." "Do not lie to me, child. I am too old for lies, and you are too poor at telling them." The old woman patted the seat beside her. "Come, sit. Tell me what you are truly afraid of." Honoria sat, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "There is a man among the guests, Mr. Edmund Fairfax. He what? He has pursued me in London, made offers I declined. He knows my true identity, and he has threatened to expose me if I do not accept his suit." Lady Marguerite's expression hardened. "Has he indeed? And my nephew knows of this?" "No, I have not. We have not discussed." "Then we shall discuss it now." Lady Marguerite rose with surprising energy for a woman of her years. "Wait here. Touch nothing. And for heaven's sake, stop looking as though you are about to faint." She swept out before Honoria could protest, leaving her alone with her terror and the sounds of arriving guests echoing up from below. Edmund Fairfax. Of all the complications she had feared, she had not anticipated this one. He had pursued her for 2 seasons with increasing persistence, his charm curdling into something uglier each time she refused him. The last time they had spoken, at a musicale 3 months past, he had cornered her in an alcove and made his position clear. She would accept his proposal, or he would make inquiries that would destroy her. She had laughed it off then, certain he was bluffing. But now he was here, in this house, with access to her family and her sister, and everything she had worked to protect. The door opened, and Sebastian entered. He looked different than he had that morning, more formal, more Viscount-like. His casual country clothes replaced by the elegant attire appropriate for receiving guests. But his eyes, when they found hers, held the same intensity she had come to recognize. "My aunt tells me there is a problem. Your aunt talks too much. My aunt is remarkably discreet, which is how I know this must be serious." He crossed to stand before her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Who is Edmund Fairfax to you?" "No one. A man who has made unwelcome advances. Nothing I cannot handle." "Honoria." He said her name softly, and something in her chest constricted. The truth, remember? That was our agreement. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all her secrets pressing down on her. He knows who I am, my real name, my family's circumstances. He discovered, I do not know how, that I am the author behind my pseudonym. He has threatened to expose me unless I accept his proposal. The silence that followed was terrible. When she opened her eyes, Sebastian's expression had transformed. The warmth she had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by something cold and hard and dangerous. He has blackmailed you. He has made threats. They are not quite the same thing. They are exactly the same thing. Sebastian's voice was flat, controlled in a way that suggested tremendous effort. How long has this been going on? 3 months. Since the Hartwell musicale. 3 months. He turned away, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration she had not seen from him before. And you did not think to mention this during our discussions of truth and honesty? I did not think he would be here. I did not know he was connected to the Fairfields. He is George Fairfield's cousin. His mother was a Fairfield before her marriage. Sebastian's voice was bitter. If I had known, if you had told me, what would you have done? I would have... He stopped, turning to face her with an expression that made her breath catch. I would have protected you. I would have found a way to stop him before he could hurt you. You barely know me. I know enough. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides and took her hands, gripping them tightly. I know that you are brilliant and brave and far too willing to sacrifice yourself for others. I know that you have spent your entire life protecting your family, and no one has ever thought to protect you. I know that when you wrote to me, you reached across an impossible distance to offer connection. And I... He stopped, something shifting in his expression. You what? I am not going to let him hurt you. Sebastian released her hands and stepped back, his face settling into the cold mask she remembered from their first meeting. Wait here. I must greet the guests. Sebastian. But he was already gone, the door closing firmly behind him. The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and forced pleasantries. Honoria remained in Lady Marguerite's sitting room, officially excused from the greeting rituals on account of her position as a mere companion. But she could hear the noise from below, voices raised in greeting, the shuffle of footsteps and luggage, the particular chaos of a household preparing for celebration. At some point, Cecily slipped away from the gathering and found her way upstairs. Honoria! Her sister burst through the door and threw her arms around her neck. I thought I should die, waiting to see you. How are you? How has it been? Has anyone suspected? I am well. It has been educational. Honoria extracted herself from her sister's embrace. Cecily, why did you not tell me Edmund Fairfax would be among the guests? Cecily's face fell. I did not know until 2 days ago. George's mother insisted on inviting him. He is family, after all, even if George cannot stand him. By the time I learned, there was no way to warn you. He knows who I am. He knows about my writing. What? Cecily's eyes went wide. How? I do not know. But he has threatened to expose me unless I accept his proposal. Honoria began to pace, her skirts swishing against the carpet. I thought I had escaped him by coming here, but instead I have walked directly into a trap. Have you told Lord Thornbury? He knows. Lady Marguerite told him. And? Cecily's voice was eager. What did he say? He said he would protect me. Honoria stopped pacing, staring at the wall. I do not know what that means. It means he cares for you. Cecily crossed to take her sister's hands, her expression softening. Honoria, anyone can see there is something between you. The way he looks at you. The way he looks at me is the way a scholar looks at an interesting manuscript. I am a puzzle to be solved, nothing more. You are lying to yourself, which is a very bad habit for a novelist. Cecily squeezed her hands. Trust him. Trust yourself. And for heaven's sake, stop assuming the worst. Before Honoria could respond, a footman appeared in the doorway. Miss Black? Lord Thornbury requests your presence in the library. The library was transformed. Where it had been quiet and scholarly, it was now alive with guests examining the bookshelves, clustered in conversation groups, admiring the view from the tall windows. Sebastian stood near the fireplace, engaged in discussion with George Fairfield and several older gentlemen. And there, positioned near the door, as though he had been waiting for her, was Edmund Fairfax. Miss Black, he said smoothly, his eyes glinting with amusement. Or should I say Miss Blackwell? What a delightful surprise to find you here. Honoria's spine went rigid. Mr. Fairfax, I was not aware you would be among the guests. Nor I that you would be playing lady's companion to our host's aunt. He moved closer, lowering his voice. A bold stratagem, I must admit. Infiltrating the household of a viscount. I wonder what Lord Thornbury would think if he knew who was really caring for his beloved aunt. I imagine he would think very little of men who make threats against women. Threats? Edmund's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. I have made no threats. I have merely expressed my deep and abiding admiration for your many talents, literary and otherwise. A man cannot be blamed for admiring a woman of quality. His emphasis on the last two words made her skin crawl. He knew everything. What do you want? She asked quietly. What I have always wanted. Your hand in marriage. Your name as my wife. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. Think of what we could accomplish together, Honoria. Your talent, my connections. We would be the talk of London. You would have me write for your profit. I would have you write for our profit. There is a difference. There is no difference at all. She stepped back, putting distance between them. I will never marry you, Mr. Fairfax. Not if you were the last man in England. His expression hardened. Then perhaps I should speak with our host. I am sure Lord Thornbury would be fascinated to learn that his aunt's companion is actually a notorious authoress who has been deceiving his household for the past week. I would not do that if I were you. The voice came from behind her, low, controlled, and carrying an edge of danger that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. Sebastian stepped forward, positioning himself between Honoria and Edmund with the casual grace of a man who knew exactly how much power he wielded. Lord Thornbury. Edmund's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in his eyes. I was just renewing my acquaintance with Miss Black. Were you? How pleasant. Sebastian's voice was ice. I must ask you to excuse her, however. My aunt requires her presence. Of course, of course. Edmund executed a shallow bow. We shall continue our conversation later, Miss Black. He moved away into the crowd, but not before shooting Honoria a look that promised this was far from over. Come with me, Sebastian said quietly. Now. He led her out of the library, through a side corridor, and into a small parlour she had not seen before. As soon as the door closed, his controlled facade cracked. He threatened you. In my house. In front of me. He did not threaten me. He merely... Do not defend him. Sebastian's voice was sharp. I heard enough. He intends to expose you unless you accept his proposal. Yes, that is the situation. Then the situation must be changed. He began to pace, much as she had done earlier, his movements sharp with agitation. I will speak to him. I will make it clear that any attempt to harm you will have consequences. And what consequences can you possibly... I am a viscount. I have connections, resources, social standing that Mr. Edmund Fairfax cannot match. Sebastian stopped pacing and turned to face her. More importantly, I have information. Do you know how Mr. Fairfax has financed his comfortable lifestyle these past years? I assume through family connections. You assume wrong. He has been systematically embezzling from his elderly grandmother's estate. Small amounts, difficult to trace, but enough to maintain appearances while the old woman's fortune slowly dwindles. Sebastian's smile was cold. I have evidence, ledgers, receipts, correspondence with his man of business, enough to destroy him utterly if I choose to make it public. Honoria stared at him. How do you know this? I told you I collect things, not just manuscripts and books, but information. It is a habit I developed in the years after Elizabeth's death, when I needed something to occupy my mind. He moved closer, his expression softening. When my aunt told me about your situation, I made inquiries. I wanted to be prepared. You investigated him, for me. I protect what I value. He reached out and took her hands, much as he had done that morning in the library. Honoria, listen to me. Edmund Fairfax cannot hurt you. His threats are empty. He has far more to lose than you do if secrets start coming to light. But my writing my identity is yours to reveal or conceal as you choose. His grip on her hands tightened. If you wish to remain anonymous, you shall. If you wish to claim your work publicly, I will support you. But you will not be blackmailed into marriage, not by Edmund Fairfax or anyone else. Honoria felt something break open inside her, some wall she had built long ago, crumbling under the weight of his fierce certainty. Why? She whispered. Why do you care so much? Because you wrote to me. His voice roughened with emotion. Because you reached across an impossible distance and offered connection when I had given up on ever feeling connected again. Because in 3 weeks of reading your letter and 1 week of knowing you, you have become... He stopped, and she saw him struggling with words that did not come easily. I have become what? She prompted. Necessary. He said it simply, as though it were an obvious truth. You have become necessary to me, Anora Blackwell, and I am not prepared to let you go. The words hung between them, enormous and terrifying and full of possibility. Sebastian. But before she could finish, the door burst open and Lady Marguerite swept in, her face pale with distress. Sebastian, you must come at once. That dreadful Fairfax man has cornered George and Cecily in the drawing room. He is making some sort of announcement about Miss Blackwell's identity. Sebastian's expression transformed into something terrible, cold fury barely contained. Stay here, he ordered Honoria. Do not follow me. Then he was gone, striding down the corridor with murder in his eyes, and Honoria was left alone with her racing heart and the terrifying knowledge that everything was about to fall apart. She did not stay. She could not stay, not when her sister was in danger, not when Edmund Fairfax was about to destroy everything she had worked to protect. Honoria gathered her skirts and ran, following the sounds of raised voices to the drawing room. She arrived to find chaos. Edmund stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the assembled guests, his voice carrying with the theatrical confidence of a man who believed himself in control. And so I must inform you all that we have been harboring a serpent in our midst. The woman calling herself Miss Helena Black is actually Miss Anora Blackwell, spinster daughter of the late Mr. Reginald Blackwell, and more significantly, Mr. Fairfax. Sebastian's voice cut through the room like a blade, silencing Edmund mid-sentence. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain. You have something you wish to say to me. Edmund faltered, some of his confidence evaporating in the face of Sebastian's cold fury. I was merely informing our fellow guests. You were about to reveal private information about a woman in my household without her consent. Sebastian moved forward, and the crowd parted before him. Information that you obtained through dishonorable means and have used to threaten and coerce. That is a serious accusation, my lord. It is a factual statement. Sebastian reached Edmund and stopped, close enough that the other man had to look up to meet his eyes. As is this. I know about the funds you have misappropriated from your grandmother's estate. I have evidence detailed, irrefutable evidence that would see you ruined, imprisoned, and cast out of decent society forever. Edmund went pale. I don't know what you're... You have a choice. Sebastian's voice was quiet, but carried to every corner of the room. You may apologize to Miss Blackwell for your ungentlemanly conduct, withdraw your allegations, and leave this house immediately, or I may share my evidence with your grandmother, your family, and the appropriate legal authorities. The silence was absolute. Every eye in the room moved between Sebastian and Edmund, watching the confrontation unfold. Honoria stepped forward from the doorway. Lord Thornbury. Do you accept his choice, Miss Blackwell? Sebastian did not look at her, his gaze fixed on Edmund. Or do you wish me to destroy him regardless? It was not a bluff. She could see it in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the coiled tension of his body. Sebastian Ashworth would cheerfully ruin Edmund Fairfax if she asked it of him. The power was overwhelming and terrifying. I accept his choice, she said quietly. If he apologizes and leaves, I will consider the matter closed. Edmund's face contorted with suppressed rage. For a moment, Honoria thought he would refuse, would call their bluff, would force the confrontation to its ultimate conclusion. Then his shoulders sagged, and the fight went out of him. I apologize, he said through gritted teeth, to Miss Blackwell, for any misunderstanding. And you will leave this house within the hour, Sebastian added. You will not return. You will not contact Miss Blackwell or her family again. You will, in fact, conduct yourself with the discretion appropriate to a gentleman, something you have clearly forgotten how to do. Yes, Edmund muttered. Fine. I will go. He pushed past Sebastian and out of the room, not looking at anyone. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the distant slam of a door. And then everyone was talking at once. The next hour was a blur of explanations, apologies, and careful maneuvering. Sebastian handled most of it, explaining to the assembled guests that Miss Blackwell had come to Ashworth Hall under an assumed name for personal reasons, that she was known to him and to his aunt, that her character was above reproach. His authority and social standing smoothed over the awkwardness of the situation, transforming what could have been a scandal into merely an interesting story. Lady Marguerite played her part perfectly, expressing loud approval of dear Miss Blackwell and making pointed comments about certain men who cannot accept rejection gracefully. Even Mrs. Blackwell, once she recovered from the shock of finding her eldest daughter installed in a viscount's household, managed to behave with dignity, though Honoria suspected this was largely because she had realized exactly what kind of connection her daughter had somehow made. But it was Cecily who found Honoria in a quiet corner and said the words that mattered most. "He loves you," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Lord Thornbury, anyone can see it. He barely knows me. He knows you better than anyone else alive. He sees you, Honoria, the real you, not the masks you wear." Cecily squeezed her hand. "Don't run away from this, please." Before Honoria could respond, Sebastian appeared at her elbow. "Miss Blackwell, may I speak with you privately?" She let him lead her out of the drawing room, through the corridors of Ashworth Hall, until they stood once again in the library, where everything had begun. The autumn sunset painted the windows gold and amber, and the books seemed to glow with reflected light. "I owe you an apology," Sebastian said quietly. "For what?" "For handling that situation without consulting you. for making decisions about your life without your input." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. "I saw him threatening you, and I acted. I did not stop to ask what you wanted. You protected me. I tried to protect you. Whether I succeeded is for you to decide." He turned to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that she had never seen before. "Honoria, I need to tell you something. Something I have been avoiding for days, because I did not know how to say it." "What is it?" "When I read your letter, when I first read it, 3 weeks ago, I felt something I had not felt in 5 years. Hope. The desperate, terrifying hope that I might not have to spend the rest of my life alone." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse in his throat. "And when I met you, when I saw the woman behind the words, Sebastian." "Let me finish, please." His voice was rough. "I know this is sudden. I know we have known each other barely a week, that our acquaintance began in deception and has been conducted in secret. I know I am not an easy man. I am cold and difficult and far too accustomed to solitude. But He stopped, and she saw him gathering courage like a man preparing to leap into an abyss. "I love you," he said. "I love your brilliance and your bravery, and the way you hide your soft heart behind sharp words. I love that you wrote to a stranger because you could not bear to be lonely anymore. I love that you see me the real me, not the title or the fortune or the reputation." His hands were trembling as he reached for hers. "And I need to know if there is any possibility that you might, someday, feel the same." Honoria stared at him, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every reason she should refuse. They barely knew each other. Their acquaintance had been built on deception. He was a viscount, and she was a spinster authoress with a family on the brink of ruin. But none of those reasons mattered, because she looked at Sebastian Ashworth, wounded, brilliant, unexpectedly tender Sebastian, and she knew the truth she had been avoiding for days. "I do not need someday," she said softly. "I feel it now." His breath caught. "Honoria, I love you." The words came out easier than she expected, as though they had been waiting inside her for years. "I love your intensity and your collection of rare manuscripts and the way you memorized my letter. I love that you saw through my masks and did not run away from what you found beneath." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight rasp of stubble beneath her fingertips. "I love you," she said again, "and I am terrified, and I do not know what happens next." Sebastian's answer was not words. He kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses her heroines experienced in drawing rooms and gardens proper, restrained, socially acceptable. This was something else entirely. His mouth found hers with desperate urgency, his hands cupping her face as though she were precious, and Honoria felt herself dissolving into sensation. This was what she had imagined when she wrote those scenes. This was what she had longed for without knowing its name. This was— "We should stop," Sebastian murmured against her lips. "There are guests, your family, propriety." "Damn propriety," Honoria said, and kissed him again. They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by thousands of books and centuries of accumulated words, and for the first time in her life, Anora Blackwell felt entirely, perfectly, gloriously seen. The knock at the library door came far too soon. "Sebastian?" Lady Marguerite's voice carried through the wood, amused and knowing. "I trust you are not compromising that young woman in there." Sebastian pulled back, his grey eyes dark with emotion. "My aunt has terrible timing." "Your aunt has excellent timing." Honoria straightened her dress, trying to compose herself. "Another few minutes and—" "Yes, quite." He cleared his throat and raised his voice. "We will be out shortly, Aunt." See that you are. Mrs. Blackwell is asking questions, and I am running out of evasive answers." They heard her footsteps retreating, and Sebastian turned back to Honoria with an expression that made her pulse race. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that I should speak to your mother. There are formalities to observe." "Are you asking if you may court me?" "I am asking if you will marry me." He said it simply, without artifice. "I know it is too soon. I know there are 100 reasons we should wait. But I have spent 5 years in frozen grief, and now that I have found warmth again, I cannot bear the thought of losing it." Honoria's breath caught. "Sebastian, you do not have to answer now. I know this is overwhelming. I know you have your writing, your family, your independence to consider." He took her hands, his grip gentle but firm. "I only ask that you do not dismiss the possibility, that you give us a chance to see what we might build together." She looked at him, this impossible, complicated, unexpectedly perfect man, and felt the last of her walls crumble. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you will consider it. Or, yes, I will marry you." She laughed at his expression of stunned disbelief. "Did you think I would refuse? After everything you have done, everything you have shown me about yourself?" "I thought I hoped, but I did not dare." He broke off, pulling her into his arms with sudden fierceness. "God, Honoria, you have no idea what you have given me." "I think I do," she whispered against his chest. "Because you have given me the same thing." They stood there, wrapped in each other, until another knock at the door reminded them that the world outside was still waiting. The announcement came that evening, at dinner. Sebastian stood at the head of the table, surrounded by guests who had no idea what was about to happen, and raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered to celebrate the engagement of Mr. George Fairfield and Miss Cecily Blackwell, a match that brings together 2 families in friendship and affection." He paused, and his eyes found Honoria's across the room. "But I must confess that I have another announcement to make, one that is perhaps somewhat unexpected, but no less joyful." He moved around the table until he stood beside her chair, offering his hand. "Miss Anora Blackwell has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The reaction was everything Honoria had feared and hoped for simultaneously. Gasps of surprise, murmurs of confusion, her mother's face transforming from shock to calculation to pure delight in the space of 3 seconds. But Sebastian's hand was warm in hers, and his eyes held nothing but certainty, and somehow none of the rest of it mattered. "Well," Lady Marguerite said into the silence, her voice carrying with satisfaction, "I believe this calls for champagne." Later, long after the toasts had been drunk, and the congratulations offered, and the guests had finally, mercifully retired, Honoria found herself alone in the library once more. She stood at the window, watching the moon rise over the autumn gardens, and tried to understand how her life had changed so completely in the span of a single week. The door opened behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. "You should be in bed," Sebastian said, crossing to stand beside her. "It has been an exhausting day. I could not sleep. Too much has happened." She turned to face him, drinking in the sight of him in the moonlight. "Is this real?" "It is real." He reached out and took her hands, drawing her closer. "I have asked myself the same question a dozen times today. Whether I am dreaming, whether I will wake to find myself alone again. And what do you conclude? That you are here, that you are real, that somehow, impossibly, you have chosen me." He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "And that I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that choice." Honoria felt tears prick at her eyes. "I never believed this was possible. Love like this, connection like this. I wrote about it in my novels, but I never truly believed it could happen to me. Then let me prove it to you. Every day, for the rest of our lives." He drew her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you, Anora Blackwell. I love your words and your wit and your stubborn, beautiful heart." She looked up at him, at this man who had read her letter and memorized every word, who had seen through her masks and loved what he found beneath, and felt the truth of everything she had written settling into her bones. The bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another, and she had been recognized at last. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than I have words to express." Sebastian's answer was a kiss, tender and fierce, and full of promise. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last vestiges of who she had been and making room for who she was becoming. And somewhere in the study, on the desk where he had left it, her letter lay waiting, creased and worn from repeated handling, but still holding the words that had changed everything. Words she had written in a moment of wine-loosened honesty. Words that had bridged the distance between two lonely hearts. Words that had begun, though she had not known it then, the greatest love story she would ever tell. The morning after Sebastian's announcement dawned grey and misty, the kind of autumn day that wrapped Ashworth Hall in cotton wool and muffled the world beyond its walls. Anora woke to find a letter slipped beneath her door, thick cream paper, sealed with the Ashworth crest, her name written in Sebastian's angular hand. She opened it with fingers that trembled slightly, still not quite believing that any of this was real. "My dearest Anora, I have spent the night attempting to compose something worthy of the woman who wrote to me 3 weeks ago with such devastating honesty. I find myself inadequate to the task. You have spent years perfecting the art of putting words to emotion, while I have spent years avoiding emotion entirely. You will have to be patient with my clumsy attempts. But here is what I know. I woke this morning thinking of you. I fell asleep last night thinking of you, and every moment in between has been colored by the knowledge that you have agreed to be my wife. I do not deserve you. I am aware of this. You are brilliant and brave and full of light, while I have become a man of shadows and silence. But I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your choice. I intend to give you everything I have, my name, my home, my heart, my absolutely excessive collection of medieval manuscripts. Come to the library when you wake. I have something to show you. Yours, in every way that matters." Sebastian Honoria pressed the letter to her chest, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She had written countless love letters in her novels, passionate declarations, desperate confessions, tender promises. But none of them had prepared her for the simple, devastating reality of being loved by Sebastian Ashworth. She dressed quickly, not bothering to call for a maid, and made her way through the quiet corridors to the library. Sebastian was waiting for her. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the grey morning light, and when he turned at the sound of her entrance, his face transformed with something that looked very like wonder. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." She crossed to him, drawn by an invisible thread she could not have resisted if she tried. "Your letter was beautiful." "My letter was inadequate, but I am glad it pleased you." He reached out and took her hands, drawing her closer. "I have something to show you, something I should have shown you days ago." He led her to a corner of the library she had not yet explored, a section where the books gave way to display cases filled with documents and letters. Sebastian stopped before one case in particular and gestured for her to look. Inside, preserved under glass, was a collection of letters in various hands. But it was the one in the center that caught her attention, yellowed paper covered in familiar handwriting. Her handwriting. "My letter," she breathed. "You had it framed?" "I had it preserved. There is a difference." but his voice was warm, almost sheepish. "I told you I had memorized it. What I did not tell you was that I have read it every night since it arrived, that I kept it beside my bed like a talisman, that when the darkness threatened to swallow me whole, your words were the light I clung to." Anora stared at the letter, at the evidence of her own drunken honesty, now treated with the reverence of a sacred text, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. "I thought you would think me foolish," she whispered. "A silly woman, writing to a stranger about loneliness and connection. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever encountered." Sebastian moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "Do you know how rare it is? True honesty. Most people spend their entire lives hiding behind pleasantries and social masks, never saying what they actually mean, never admitting what they actually feel. And then you, a woman I had never met, reached across the void and offered me your authentic self. I was drunk. You were honest. The wine merely loosened your tongue enough to say what you already felt." He turned to face her, his grey eyes intense. "I fell in love with you before I ever saw your face, Anora. I fell in love with your words, your courage, your willingness to be vulnerable with a stranger. Meeting you in person only confirmed what I already knew." She could not speak. The weight of his confession pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "I have been thinking," Sebastian continued, his voice growing more uncertain, "about how we should proceed. The engagement has been announced, but we have not discussed the particulars. When you wish to marry, where, what kind of ceremony?" "Soon," Anora heard herself say. "I want to marry you soon." He blinked, clearly surprised. "I thought most women want time to plan, to prepare." "I am not most women." She reached up and touched his face, marveling at the fact that she was allowed to do so. "I have spent my entire life waiting for something I did not believe would ever come. Now that it is here, I do not wish to wait any longer." Sebastian's careful composure cracked. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and she felt him trembling against her. "A month," he said roughly. "I can arrange everything in a month. The banns, the license, whatever is required. I will speak to the vicar today." "A month." She pulled back to look at him, smiling through the tears she could no longer contain. "I can endure a month." "You will not have to merely endure it." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away her tears. "I intend to make these next weeks the happiest of your life thus far, though I confess I hope they will pale in comparison to what comes after." He kissed her then slowly, thoroughly, with all the passion she had spent years imagining and never quite believing was real. And when they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, Anora knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home at last. The month that followed was a whirlwind of preparations, negotiations, and stolen moments. Mrs. Blackwell threw herself into wedding planning with the fervour of a general marshalling troops, determined to give her eldest daughter the society wedding she had despaired of ever arranging. Guest lists were debated, menus were planned, and an endless parade of dressmakers descended upon Ashworth Hall to take measurements and discuss silks and laces. Anora endured it all with better grace than she would have thought possible, sustained by Sebastian's quiet presence and their nightly conversations in the library. These had become their ritual, waiting until the household retired, then meeting among the books to talk about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about the parents who had died young and the aunt who had raised him. She told him about her father's decline, her mother's desperation, the day she had first put pen to paper and discovered that she could create worlds. They talked about his wife, Elizabeth, and the complicated grief he still carried. "I did not love her as I should have," he confessed one night, staring into the fire. She deserved better than a husband who married her because she reminded him of someone else. Did she know? I do not think so. She was content. We were friends of a sort, but there was no passion between us, no great meeting of minds. He looked at her, shadows playing across his face. What we have this connection, this understanding, I did not know it was possible. I thought such things existed only in novels. They exist in novels because novelists wish they existed in life. Anora moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. We write what we long for. And now? Do you still long for it? No. She leaned into him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders. Now I have it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance, and Anora thought that she had never been so happy in her life. The question of her writing hung between them, unaddressed, until one evening a week before the wedding. Sebastian had been unusually quiet all day, and when they met in the library that night, Anora could tell something was troubling him. "Tell me," she said simply. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My solicitor visited today. There are papers to sign, settlements to arrange the usual business of marriage. But it made me think about what changes for you, what you might have to give up." "Give up?" "Your writing." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I know what it means to you. I know it is not a hobby or a pastime, but something essential to who you are. And I need you to know that I would never ask you to stop. Not for propriety, not for reputation, not for any reason." Anora felt something ease in her chest, a tension she had not even realized she was carrying. "I was afraid to raise the subject," she admitted. "I did not know how you would feel about being married to a notorious authoress." "I feel proud." He said it without hesitation. "Your work is extraordinary. The thought of a world without your novels, without the stories you have yet to tell, is intolerable to me." He paused, something flickering in his expression. "In fact, I have a proposal. Beyond the obvious one, I mean." "What kind of proposal?" "I have connections in the publishing world. Scholarly connections, but connections nonetheless. If you wished, if you chose, I could help you publish under your own name. Not a lady of quality, but Anora Blackwell, or Anora Ashworth, as you will soon be." She stared at him, heart pounding. "You would risk the scandal?" "I would risk anything for you." He took her hands, his grip fierce. "But I do not believe it would be the scandal you fear. Times are changing. Women are writing openly, proudly, successfully. And your work is too good to hide behind a pseudonym forever." Anora thought about what he was offering. The chance to claim her words, her stories, her achievements. The chance to be known for who she truly was. "I would have to tell my mother," she said slowly. "Yes." "She will have hysterics." "Very probably." "And then she will tell everyone she knows, because she cannot resist an opportunity to boast." "Also probable." Sebastian's mouth curved into a reluctant smile. "Is that a yes?" Anora looked at him, at this man who had seen her letter and memorized every word, who had uncovered her secrets and chosen to love her anyway, who was offering her not just his name and his heart, but the chance to claim her own identity at last. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." The wedding took place on a grey November morning, the sky threatening rain that never quite fell. Anora stood in the entrance of the small chapel on the Ashworth estate, her hand resting on her mother's arm, and tried to remember how to breathe. Her wedding dress was simple by society standards, ivory silk with minimal adornment, but she had never felt more beautiful, more herself. The chapel was full of guests, the Fairfields, including George and Cecily, who had married quietly the week before, Lady Marguerite, resplendent in purple silk, Various neighbors and acquaintances who had come to witness the notorious recluse finally take a bride. But Honoria barely saw any of them. She saw only Sebastian. He stood at the altar, tall and serious in his dark coat, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse race. As she walked toward him on her mother's arm, she watched his careful composure crack, watched emotion flood his face as he took in the sight of her. "Breathe," her mother whispered, releasing her arm and stepping back. "And try not to trip. It would quite ruin the moment." Honoria choked on a laugh, then sobered as Sebastian took her hand. "You came," he said softly, echoing his words from that morning in the library. "I will always come when you ask," she answered. The ceremony was brief, the traditional words, the exchange of rings, the vicar's solemn pronouncement that they were now man and wife. But when Sebastian kissed her, in front of God and all their witnesses, Honoria felt the weight of every word she had ever written about love settling into truth. This was real. This was hers. And it was only the beginning. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of toasts and congratulations. Honoria smiled until her face ached, accepted well wishes from people she barely knew, and counted the minutes until she could be alone with her husband. Her husband. The word still felt foreign on her tongue, impossible and wonderful. It was Lady Marguerite who finally took pity on her, intercepting a particularly determined matron who wanted to discuss the proper management of country estates. "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," the old woman said, using Honoria's new title with evident satisfaction, "you look as though you might collapse from exhaustion. Sebastian, take your wife somewhere quiet before she expires from overstimulation." "Gladly." Sebastian extended his hand, and Honoria took it with relief. "If you will excuse us." They escaped through a side door, through corridors that Honoria was still learning to navigate, until they reached a part of the house she had never seen before. Sebastian stopped at a heavy oak door and turned to face her. "I have something to show you," he said. "A wedding gift of sorts." He opened the door, and Honoria stepped into a room that made her breath catch. It was a study, her own study, she realized, taking in the details. A large desk positioned beneath a window, perfectly placed to catch the morning light. Bookshelves lining the walls, already half filled with volumes she recognized from her own meager collection. A comfortable chair by the fireplace, a writing table stocked with fresh paper and new pens and bottles of her favorite ink. And on the desk, framed in silver, was her letter. "Sebastian," she breathed. "I wanted you to have a space that was entirely yours," he said from behind her. "Somewhere you could write, could think, could be alone when you needed solitude. The connecting door leads to my study." He pointed to a second door she had not noticed. "So I will always be close by. But this room is yours. Only yours." Honoria walked slowly around the space, touching the desk, the books, the soft curtains that framed the window. Everything had been chosen with care, with attention to what she would want, what she would need. "How did you know?" she asked, turning to face him. "About the morning light, the ink, the chair by the fire. How did you know?" "I paid attention." He moved toward her, his expression soft. "I watched you these past weeks where you chose to sit, what you reached for when you thought no one was looking. I made notes. I may have interrogated your sister slightly. You made notes about my preferences? I make notes about everything. It is a scholarly habit." She laughed, the sound dissolving into something closer to tears. "I do not deserve this. Any of this. You deserve far more." He reached her, taking her hands, drawing her close. "You deserve everything beautiful and good in this world, Honoria. I intend to spend my life proving it to you." She looked up at him, at her husband, her partner, her impossible, wonderful gift, and felt words rising in her throat. Not the polished words of her novels, but something rawer, more honest. "I love you," she said. "I love you, and I do not have the words to express how much. I, who have spent my life finding words, cannot find adequate ones for this." "Then perhaps," Sebastian murmured, lowering his mouth to hers, "we should communicate in a different language." He kissed her, and she let herself fall into sensation, the warmth of his body against hers, the tenderness in his touch, the overwhelming rightness of being exactly where she belonged. Outside, the November sky finally released its rain, droplets pattering against the window in a gentle rhythm. But inside the room Sebastian had made for her, Honoria felt only warmth, only light, only home. The first year of their marriage was one of discovery. Honoria learned that Sebastian could not function before his morning coffee, that he talked in his sleep about manuscript provenance, that he had a secret weakness for marzipan that he would deny under oath. She learned that he was patient with her writing moods, understanding when she needed to disappear into a story for hours at a time. She learned that he read everything she wrote, offering thoughtful criticism when she asked for it, and unstinting praise when she needed encouragement. Sebastian learned that his wife was a creature of fierce passions, that she threw herself into her work with an intensity that sometimes frightened her, that she required long walks in the countryside to clear her head, that she could not abide being treated as fragile or inferior. He learned that she loved him with a wholeness that sometimes left him breathless, that she had transformed his cold, lonely house into a home without changing anything except the atmosphere within it. They fought, occasionally sharp words over small matters, disagreements that left them both wounded. But they always found their way back to each other, always ended their nights tangled together in the great bed that had once felt too large for one man alone. And in the spring, when Honoria told him she was with child, Sebastian wept. "I am afraid," he admitted, holding her close in the darkness of their bedroom. "After Elizabeth, after what happened." "I know." She stroked his hair, feeling him tremble against her. "I am afraid too. I cannot lose you. I cannot. You will not lose me." She pulled back to look at him, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "I am strong, Sebastian, stronger than I look, and I have far too many stories left to tell to die in childbirth like some tragic heroine." He laughed despite himself, a wet, broken sound. "You would argue with death itself." "I would, and I would win." She kissed him, gentle and fierce at once. "Trust me, trust us. We have come too far to fall now." Their daughter was born on a golden September morning, 8 years to the month since Honoria had written that fateful letter. Sebastian held Honoria's hand through the long labor, defying every convention that said men should absent themselves from such matters. He read to her from her own novels when she needed distraction, held her through the worst of the pains, and wept again when the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced infant in his arms. "A girl," he said wonderingly, looking down at the tiny creature. "We have a daughter." Honoria, exhausted but triumphant, reached for the baby. "Let me see her." He placed the infant in her arms, and Honoria looked down at a face that somehow contained both of them. Sebastian's grey eyes, her auburn hair, a chin that could have belonged to either. She felt something fundamental shift inside her, a love so fierce and overwhelming that it threatened to swallow her whole. "Eleanor," she said softly, "after my grandmother. Is that acceptable?" "Eleanor is perfect." Sebastian sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around her shoulders, his gaze fixed on their daughter. "She is perfect." They sat together in the golden morning light, 3 where there had once been 2, and Honoria thought that she had never been so complete. The years that followed were full ones. Eleanor grew from a squalling infant into a curious toddler, then into a bright, imaginative child who loved stories above all else. She was followed by Henry, a serious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's sharp tongue, and then by tiny Rose, who arrived unexpectedly and made their family complete. Ashworth Hall transformed around them. Where it had once been a monument to grief and solitude, it became a home filled with noise and laughter and the particular chaos of children. Books were everywhere, not just in the library, but scattered throughout the house, left on chairs and tables and window seats. The servants grew accustomed to stepping over abandoned volumes and retrieving pages of writing that had blown off desks. Honoria published 6 more novels in those years, each one under her own name. The scandal her mother had feared never quite materialized. Instead, Honoria found herself celebrated, sought after, invited to literary salons and intellectual gatherings. Sebastian accompanied her with obvious pride, standing at her side while she discussed her work with admirers, never once suggesting that her success threatened his masculine dignity. "You have given me far more than I have given you," he told her once, after a particularly successful evening. A home, a family, a reason to engage with the world again. All I offered in return was a library and a bad temper. "You offered me yourself," she corrected. "That was more than enough." They were happy, truly, deeply, completely happy, in a way that Honoria had never dared to believe was possible. She had written about such happiness in her novels, but she had always assumed it was fantasy, wish fulfillment, the literary equivalent of a fairy tale. Now she lived it every day, and every day she was grateful. The morning of their 8th anniversary, Honoria woke to find a letter on her pillow. She smiled, recognizing the tradition. Every year, Sebastian wrote her a letter, a real letter, not just a note, expressing something he found difficult to say aloud. She treasured each one, keeping them in a locked box beside her bed. She opened this year's letter and began to read. "My dearest Honoria, 8 years ago today, I stood at an altar and made promises I was not entirely certain I could keep. I promised to love you, to honor you, to cherish you until death parted us. At the time, I believed I understood what those words meant. I had loved before, after a fashion. I had been married before. I thought I knew what I was offering. I was wrong. I did not know that love could grow. I thought it was a fixed thing, a constant, you loved someone or you did not, and the feeling remained static. But loving you has taught me that love is a living thing, always changing, always deepening, always finding new ways to surprise me. I love you more today than I did 8 years ago. I loved you more yesterday than I did the day before. And I will love you more tomorrow than I do at this moment. Though at this moment, I love you so much, I can barely breathe. You have given me everything, Honoria. Children who carry pieces of both of us. A home that feels like warmth rather than emptiness. Work that matters. Connections that sustain. A life that I am grateful for every single day. You wrote to me once about the loneliness of being surrounded by words, seeking communion with minds that might understand. I am no longer lonely. I have not been lonely since the day I met you. I keep your letter still, that first letter, the one you wrote in a moment of wine-loosened honesty. It hangs in my study, beside your first editions, a reminder of how it all began. Sometimes I read it again, though I know every word by heart. And every time I read it, I am grateful. Grateful that you were brave enough to write. Grateful that I was wise enough to recognize what I had been given. Grateful that we found each other, against all odds, across all the walls we had built. You wrote that the bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another. I believe now that you were wrong, or rather, that you were incomplete. The bravest thing is not just to recognize, but to choose. To choose love over fear. To choose connection over safety. To choose each other, again and again, every day, even when it is difficult. Especially when it is difficult. I choose you, Anora, today and every day, forever and always. Yours, in every way that matters. Sebastian Honoria was still crying when he appeared in the doorway, a cup of tea in each hand and an uncertain expression on his face. "Was it too much?" he asked, setting the cups aside. "I worried it was too much. I am not skilled at—" She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, cutting off whatever self-deprecating disclaimer he had been about to offer. "It was perfect," she said against his mouth. "You are perfect. I love you so much I cannot contain it." "I love you too." He held her close, burying his face in her hair. "Always. Forever. However long we have." They stood there in the morning light, wrapped in each other, while downstairs their children were waking and their household was stirring, and the day was beginning to demand their attention. But for this moment, there was only the two of them, two lonely souls who had recognized each other across an impossible distance, who had chosen each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from a single, honest letter. Epilogue. 8 years later. The autumn sun slanted through the windows of the library, casting long shadows across the books that lined every wall. Outside, the gardens of Ashworth Hall blazed with colour, crimson and gold and amber, the last fierce display before winter claimed the land. Anora sat in her favourite chair by the fire, though no fire burned this afternoon. A book lay open in her lap, but she was not reading. Instead, she was watching her eldest daughter. Eleanor, at 15, was already showing signs of the woman she would become, tall for her age, with her father's grey eyes and her mother's auburn hair. Possessed of a sharp wit that delighted Anora and occasionally terrified Sebastian. She had inherited her mother's love of words and her father's love of manuscripts, and she spent hours in the library, devouring everything she could find. Today, she had discovered something new. "Mama," Eleanor said, looking up from the display case where the family treasures were kept. "What is this letter? The one in the silver frame?" Anora set aside her book and rose, crossing to stand beside her daughter. "That is the letter that brought your father and me together." "The famous letter." Eleanor had heard the story, of course everyone had heard the story, which had become something of a family legend. "May I read it?" "You may." Eleanor bent over the case, her brow furrowing as she deciphered the faded handwriting. Anora watched her daughter read, remembering the night she had written those words, the loneliness, the wine, the desperate hope that someone somewhere might understand. "You wrote this before you ever met Papa?" "I did." "And he read it and fell in love with you?" "Something like that." Anora smiled, thinking of all the complications that simple summary elided. "It was more complicated than it sounds." "It sounds romantic." Eleanor straightened, her eyes bright with questions. "Did you really break into his study to steal it back?" "I did, though I prefer to think of it as an unauthorized retrieval mission. And he had already memorized it. Every word." Eleanor shook her head, half admiring and half exasperated. "Papa is ridiculous. Your papa is devoted. There is a difference." "Is there?" The door opened, and Sebastian entered, followed by Henry and Rose. At 12 and 8 respectively, the younger children still had the energy of puppies, bouncing into the room with excited chatter about something they had discovered in the garden. "A hedgehog," Henry announced, as though this were world-changing news. "A real hedgehog, living under the rose bushes. Rose wanted to bring it inside, but I told her Mama would disapprove." "I would indeed disapprove," Anora confirmed. "Hedgehogs belong outside, where they can eat slugs and do other hedgehog activities in peace." But it was so sweet, Rose protested. It curled up into a little ball when we found it. That is its defense mechanism, darling. It was frightened of you. I wasn't going to hurt it. Rose's lower lip trembled, and Anora felt the familiar tug of maternal guilt. I know you weren't. But the hedgehog didn't know that. Perhaps we can leave some food for it near the rose bushes, and you can watch it from a distance. This suggestion was deemed acceptable, and the younger children rushed off to raid the kitchen for hedgehog-appropriate offerings. Eleanor lingered, still looking at the letter in its silver frame. You really believed you would never find love, she said quietly, when her siblings were gone. When you wrote this. I did. Anora moved to stand beside her daughter, studying the familiar words. I had convinced myself that love, real love, the kind worth having, was something that happened to other people. People who were prettier, or more agreeable, or better at pretending to be what society expected. But you found it anyway. I found it because I stopped pretending. Anora looked at her daughter, seeing in her face the echo of both Sebastian and herself. I wrote honestly to a stranger, Eleanor. I said things I had never said to anyone, things I was afraid to admit even to myself. And that honesty, that vulnerability, is what allowed your father to see me truly. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I am afraid of that, she admitted, of being seen truly. What if people don't like what they see? Then they are not your people. Sebastian's voice came from behind them. He had returned without either of them noticing. The right ones, the ones who matter, will see you truly and love you more for it, not less. He moved to stand on Eleanor's other side, and the three of them looked at the letter together, the worn paper, the faded ink, the words that had started everything. The bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another, Eleanor read aloud. You wrote that, Mama. Did you believe it when you wrote it? I wanted to believe it. Anora felt Sebastian's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in the familiar way of long-married couples. And then I met your father, and I discovered that it was true. But it's not just about recognizing, Eleanor said slowly, working through the idea. It's about choosing. Papa wrote that in his letter to you last anniversary. The bravest thing is to choose love over fear. Your papa is very wise. Your papa was quoting your mother, who is wiser still. Sebastian smiled, the expression softening his sharp features. I have spent 16 years trying to find words adequate to express what your mother means to me. I have not yet succeeded. But I keep trying. Eleanor looked between them, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled a genuine smile, warm and open in a way that was becoming rarer as she approached womanhood. I hope I find what you have found, she said quietly. Someday. You will. Anora reached out and touched her daughter's cheek. They stood together in the autumn light, 3 generations of Ashworth women, for Eleanor had Sebastian's name but her mother's spirit, looking at the letter that had started it all. Outside, Henry and Rose returned from their hedgehog expedition, their voices carrying through the windows. The household was stirring, servants preparing for dinner, the comfortable chaos of family life resuming its rhythm. Sebastian caught Honora's eye and smiled the private smile he reserved only for her, full of memory and meaning. No regrets? He asked softly. None. She squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his grip. Not a single one. They turned from the display case, ready to rejoin their children, their household, their life. But Anora paused at the doorway, looking back at the letter one more time. She thought about the woman who had written those words, lonely, afraid, convinced she would never find connection. She thought about the man who had received them, grieving, isolated, equally certain he would never feel again. Neither of them could have imagined this. This life, this love, these children who carried pieces of both of them into the future. This home filled with books and laughter, and the particular chaos of happiness. But they had found it anyway, because one soul had been brave enough to reach out, and another had been wise enough to recognize what he had been given. "Coming?" Sebastian asked from the doorway. Honoria smiled, feeling the weight of all her years settling into contentment. "Yes," she said, "always." She took her husband's hand and walked with him into the golden afternoon, into the life they had built together, into the story that was still being written. And somewhere in the library behind them, a letter in a silver frame caught the last light of the setting sun, the words still legible after all these years, still carrying the truth that had changed everything. The bravest thing one soul can do is recognize another.